What's up? CJ here. It's been a while since my last video here on the Syntax channel, and a lot has happened since I last made a video. So this video and the next two videos that I make are actually going to be recapping some of the new and interesting things that are happening in the world of JavaScript. And this video is all about React Conf, which happened about 2 weeks ago at this point, and it was a 2-day conference, so let's jump right in. I'm going to talk about all of the interesting things that happened, all of the announcements, and everything in between. So day one, there were quite a few announcements regarding React itself, and you probably saw a blog post a few weeks ago announcing React 19 beta. They talked about all the new features coming in React 19 and basically announced that the library was now in beta. But at React Conf, there was another announcement.
And so far, the feedback on the beta has been pretty good. So as a result, today, we are upgrading the beta to an RC, release candidate. Right?
And so what that means is now that it's RC or release candidate, you can expect that if you upgrade your app to React 19, there likely will not be any breaking changes, and you're basically at a point where if you upgrade, when they release the official version, you should be in a good spot to use all of those features. Now, if you want to learn more about the RC, it's at the exact same link as before. So they basically took the React 19 beta announcement and they did a find and replace for the word beta and just put RC on it. But all those features are coming. And if you want to learn more about them, definitely check out episode 768 of Syntax. So Wes and Scott dive deep into all the new features that are coming. They talk about what they like. They talk about some of the features that they've already tried using. So definitely give that episode a listen if you want to learn more about React 19. Now, there also was another big announcement in the world of React.
We've tested and shipped React Compiler at Meta. And at this point, we need your feedback to help get it ready for widespread adoption. So I'm excited to share that today, we are open sourcing React Compiler and publishing.
Yep, so you can check out that link there. You can take a look at the React compiler and also the docs on it and what it is, what it does, etc. And at React Conf, there was a talk that kind of dove into what happens when you use the React compiler. And so essentially, you can take a code base that required a lot of manual optimization, so things like using memo to memoize components or use memo to memoize complex calculations. And instead of having to do all of that manually, you can just run the compiler and your code is just as performant without needing to write all of that yourself.
Delete all the memoization that I added, restart the server, but with the new tool that we just built. And going back to our app, there's no re-rendering of playlist. Our app is performant even without manual memoization.
So it's pretty slick, and it's a pretty cool thing that in the future you'll be able to write React code that you don't have to manually optimize, and the React compiler will do that for you. But there are more things that can be done than just auto memoization. And at the end of day one, there was a Q&A session, and Joe kind of talked about some of the things that would be possible now that we have a compiler.
It is not only about auto memoization. It is a compiler that deeply understands React. So one thing we've talked about is shipping an ability to call context or hooks from inside use memo callbacks, where you could have more fine-grained access, so that, for example, today, if a component accesses context, well, whenever that context changes, the component will re-render. With the compiler, we are going to, if that piece hasn't changed, it will quickly bail out and it'll get an optimization. But we could go further and actually figure out, the context changed, but we can just figure out, we don't need to do anything in this component at all, which would obviously be even better. And so that's a case where we can start to say, does this even need to be an API? Or could this just be an optimization that you never have to think about? React just works faster out of the box.
So it's a new way to even think about React code bases with the introduction of the compiler. So like Joe was saying, you might reach a point where you no longer have to use these functions that are exposed by React, like use memo or memo or use callback or whatever else. Everything is just handled for you, and you don't even have to think about code at that level. And especially this idea, like it doesn't exist yet, which Joe talks about right after this, but just the fact that it could be possible to automatically optimize your code that's using context instead of re-rendering an entire tree when anything in the context changes. It can be smarter about what it decides to re-render. So that is an exciting future for React and the compiler. Now, another talk that happened was Lydia Halley's What's New in React 19. So she just detailed all of the new features in React 19, but with some really good diagrams and animations and illustrations. So if you have not heard of Lydia Halley, she has a YouTube channel where she has some really good visualizations that describe some complex topics. So things like promise execution, the event loop, and also execution context and different things like that. So Lydia's got some really good visualizations for talking about and explaining some of the newer features in React 19, so definitely check that talk out. Now, another thing that happened was the announcement of the merging of Remix and React Router. So you can check out this blog post that kind of details what's happening, but essentially the Remix team saw themselves gradually refactoring things out of Remix into React Router because they were useful for React Router. And they essentially reached a point where it didn't make sense to have Remix be a separate library. So they are merging.
So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to bring the Vite plugin from Remix over to React Router. And now you'll have easier access to all the features React Router already has, but Vite just makes it more convenient. It's not out yet, but it will be in React Router v7.
So essentially with this release, now you can just have a Vite plugin and get the benefits that you would have gotten by potentially migrating your code to Remix, but instead of just using your existing code with React Router. So it's a pretty exciting future. And you might also be wondering, though, what's going to happen to Remix? And Ryan talks about that here as well.
Remix is going to just take a little nap. We got some ideas for what Remix, the project, the code is in the future. But for the time being, all the code, we've been doing this the whole time. We've been moving Remix features over to React Router ever since we started building Remix. And we're just at the point now where it's like, yeah, the last thing is just this Vite plugin, so let's just bring it over. So Remix is going to take a little nap. The brand, the swag, we've got some, go get it. The team, we're the Remix team. We have Remix meetups, we have Remix community. We're not getting rid of any of that stuff.
So Remix will still exist, you just won't install it anymore. It's just going to be basically a community and a brand, but you will install React Router. Now, another interesting talk that happened was by Sunil Pai, and they talked about a new framework that they're working on. And first up, they talked about one of the pain points of working with Next.js and React Server Components.
The thing that bothers me about server components ever since I started trying them out, and folks here who might have tried it out in Next.js or somewhere else, will know that you can't use state and context with server components. It just says, nope, those are client-side things. You might have a component, a very simple counter, and you say, hey, counter, set counter, you state, and on button, you increment it by 1. This won't work. Like the compiler will throw and say, nope, you cannot import useState inside a server component.
So we've probably all run into this, especially if we've tried to learn about React Server Components and start to use them. But what Sunil mentioned is there is this thing that was created at Cloudflare called durable objects. And this idea that you could have serverless workers that maintain state in some way. So they thought, what if you combine this idea of serverless functions with state with the idea of React Server Components, and essentially a React Party was born.
And it looks great. It's exactly the API that I told you. It uses this serverless compute model to maintain state that lives, and it exposes it with hooks that just look like they're from React itself.
So you can see here, like use state, use reducer, create context, all of these things imported from React Party, but you can use them in React Server Components. So this will be an interesting library to keep an eye on to see kind of where this heads. And it's also cool to see that libraries like this are popping up now that React Server Components are being used more and more. Now, another thing that came up was signals. And if you haven't heard of signals, they are essentially a way of managing state in your JavaScript apps where you have some place where state is defined, and then you have somewhere else where that state is potentially accessed. And anytime the state is changed, that those locations where it's accessed will be updated in a fine-grained way. And a lot of frameworks have used this idea even all the way back to 2010. Solid.js probably popularized it the most these days, but most other frameworks aside from React are using signals. And so a question was asked during the Q&A at React Conf Day 1 of, will we ever see signals inside of React? And especially because if you have not seen it, there is this proposal here. It's currently stage 1, but it is a proposal to the ECMAScript standard that would potentially bring signals as a primitive to JavaScript itself. So instead of needing to exist within libraries and frameworks, it could exist directly inside of JavaScript, and then these libraries and frameworks could take advantage of that. So you potentially would get this capital S signal object that can create state, create computed state, and then you would have effect that anywhere in any library or any framework that needs to use the signal could have this effect here and take advantage of this stuff with like native optimizations and everything else if signals were actually running in JavaScript itself. So signals are interesting, and they're kind of all over JavaScript right now. So the question is, will we ever see signals in the world of React? And it was mentioned that if this is ever adopted into the language, like I said, it's stage 1. It's not actually in the JavaScript language yet. But if it was, it's possible that things like the React compiler would take advantage of it. But Joe also dives into why you potentially won't see signals in the world of React, simply because of this simpler model of not having to think about where the state updates and just thinking about, okay, I have a view, I have my state, it re-renders, everything updates from there. So Joe will talk about that.
We think that is a lot easier as developers to write first-order programs where you just write your UI, right? You just write a function that describes the state of your UI. And then from that, we can extract out that computation graph and use that to optimize your application. So signals, if we were to explore them, it would be an implementation detail. We're not even sure that that's actually the most optimal implementation detail. Really, so it's great that other frameworks are exploring it. Genuinely mean that. Like, it's really great that there's so much exploration of different approaches in the ecosystem. But we don't think it's really the right fit for React as a programming model. We don't think it's a great fit for the implementation. And in particular, just that ability to write code that describes the current state of the UI and think in that way is just so simple, and I think that's what's made React so approachable to so many developers. And the key thing is, as we showed in the compiler section, we just can take that information and optimize it under the hood.
So yeah, it's super interesting to hear from the React team that they're not exactly considering signals because they can potentially introduce these optimizations. And it's a different way to think about the problem, because signals are a way for programmers to basically create sections of their app that are creating state and then other sections that are accessing the state. But they do have to manage that. But the whole thought process here is, if developers don't have to think about that and the compiler can do it instead, then that's potentially a better way to go, which it's interesting. It's interesting to hear different perspectives. Aside from all the React stuff, there was also talk of React Native. And so Evan gave a talk on using universal server components with React Native, and he gave a really great demo that basically showed a completely native app that was using React server components and server rendering.
Got the Expo AI app here, so we can open it up. And this is an end-to-end React Native app running server components. This is the, as far as I know, the first server-rendered React Native app. And let's go ahead and hit list new movies. And we got our trending movies here. We can scroll through them, look pretty good. We can long press to see the casting crew. One thing you'll notice is actually when I do that long press, there's going to be a little loading indicator. What that is a server action fetching more data and rendering down more UI menu elements, and then pulling them in. So we can search for an actor just like we did before. We could select a movie, create an event. Create an event will stream down a calendar card.
So it's fascinating to see that all of this stuff actually is server rendered. And in the world of building native apps, this is something that you really haven't seen before. Typically, when you're building a native app, you're always interfacing with some kind of like JSON API and then rebuilding the UI on the client. But this is using the React Server Component spec, so you can actually render from the server, which is fascinating. And if you check out Evan's talk, he shows some code examples. He shows some other scenarios where you can use it. It is pretty slick. And it also talked about when and where you can use this stuff.
Everything that I just showed you, that app is Expo SDK 51 apps. That's out today with React 19 and new architecture. The parts that are still work in progress are going to be the concurrent router, the server actions, the server render part. And we move fast, we can have that out later this year. So we'll have maybe all the pieces, or maybe sometime next year, I don't know. So consider this an RFC.
So basically what he's saying is he showed what's possible, but now we want to hear from the community in terms of, is this interesting? Is this something you would want to do? How would you want to use it? Before it gets into a more like stable API that gets adopted into React Native and Expo. So you can check out this blog post that talks about Expo SDK 51. And a lot of this was also talked about on day 2 as well. So day 1 was all about new features in React, a few new features in React Native, but day 2 was definitely heavy React Native. And so let's talk about that. There was a big release of something as well.
And that's why I'm very excited. I'm very proud of the team today to announce that we are considering the React Native new architecture officially in beta.
So you can tell there's a theme here. Lots of stuff getting either RC or beta tags, basically as a signal that these are things that you can start to use yourself, and you can expect that there will be less breaking changes when the official things are announced. But the React Native new architecture, if you want to learn about it, there is a discussion over on GitHub that talks about the newer features. Also, there's a section in the React Native docs that talk about the new things like synchronous layouts and effects, support for concurrent rendering, and then also fast JavaScript or native interfacing. Now, another interesting announcement that came from day 2 was this idea of React Native frameworks. We've actually seen a very similar thing happen in the world of React. If you remember, when the React docs were updated, there's a section talking about you should use a framework when you're working with React. And they mentioned you should probably use something like Next.js or something like Remix. And the world of React Native is having a very similar thing happen, where basically they're saying that if you are using React Native, you probably should be using a framework. And so this RFC was back from February. This details why they talk about this, why they made this kind of decision, and they announced what they believe is the official framework that you should use when you're working with React Native.
So that's why, starting from React Native 075, the recommendation from the React Native team for newly created app is for you to use a React Native framework. And our framework of choice is Expo. So yes, you should be using Expo for your newly created app.
And like I said, I'm not plugged into the React Native ecosystem and the Expo ecosystem. I don't think this is going to get as much pushback as potentially what we saw, depending on where you were, what circles you were in, as we saw in the world of React when they essentially said you should be using something like Next.js. I do think that most people were already using something like Expo, but it is interesting to note that now it is an official thing that you should be using Expo if you're working with React Native. Now, an interesting thing that was covered that exists in Expo is this thing called continuous native generation. And if you've ever worked in a cross-platform code base or like a React Native code base, you're probably familiar with the idea that you have to have some native code in that code base. You might have a folder for your iOS native code, your Android native code, but with continuous native generation, you potentially will no longer need that.
And not a native folder in sight. And that's because this project is using CNG, continuous native generation, to generate these folders. The idea behind CNG is that native code can be generated from a set of inputs, making it ephemeral. So in a similar way, you can run npx expo prebuild to generate the native projects based off of your app.json and package.json.
So your code bases will get smaller and simpler, and you won't have to have those native projects in the code base itself. Now, another interesting announcement was the introduction of this thing called Pigment CSS. And this actually comes from the Material UI team. And if you've kept an eye on Material UI or if you've used it in your React apps, you know that they have had a lot of different ways of working with CSS through the years. And now they're introducing a new way of doing it, but for good reason. Basically, most of the CSS and JS solutions that exist out there need the React Context API. And if you're using React Server components, you can't use the Context API in those server components. So some solutions need to exist that would allow us to have a similar style of API, but be able to use it with React Server components. And so when you look at the code, it looks very familiar. It looks like styled components or like emotion, but ultimately, one of the nice things about it is it actually can run on the server side.
If you start from emotion, which I think a huge chunk of the community is at, you effectively have two possible directions to take. You can either go into the CSS modules or the Tailwind CSS path at the cost of a costly migration, and you have to give up on some of the properties I talked about before, so either style collocation or granular style loading. Or you can go the other direction and go with the more recent library like Stylix or Panda CSS and more older Linaria. But then you still have these custom migrations, and they usually also don't go as much as they could into like a deep bundler integration.
So basically, with Pigment, you'll be able to more easily adopt it into your code base, so that way you can use it with React Server components. Now, another interesting thing that was talked about is using React Native with Apple Vision Pro. Now, this isn't a new announcement. About a year ago, it was announced that you could use React Native to build Vision Pro projects, but it was demoed, and so they talked about how you could get started with it.
Start with this today. You can create your next React Native, next Apple Vision Pro app with React Native using a single command. You can scan this code. It will direct you to the project's repository. Of course, it's open source. We're working in the open from the very first interactions that.
So it was interesting to see, and especially if you have a Vision Pro and you want to start building with it, it was interesting to see that you can use React Native. And if you check out this talk, they show a demo of it. They show what the code looks like. So it's pretty slick. Now, something that was announced a while back from Facebook is this framework called StyleX, which is basically like a CSS in JS library, but from the Meta team. And an interesting announcement and thing that was demoed is that StyleX can now be used with React Native. And in this talk, they were talking about this introduction of React Strict DOM, which basically allows you to have a React Native code base that's a bit more agnostic to React Native, so that the same code can run in both the web and on native.
And so React Native DOM is kind of like shimming all of the APIs that you're used to from the web and just bringing them to React Native. And it's built on two pillars. First, there's a unified styling model powered by StyleX. If you don't know, we open sourced StyleX back in December. It started off as an API inspired by Stylesheet from React Native. And we took it to the web, and we added all the features that you need on the web, such as media queries and pseudo classes. It turns out that the web has more constraints. We need to server render. We need more declarative APIs on the web. And now we're bringing that back to React Native. So you'll be able to use media queries and pseudo classes, and you won't have to write a whole bunch of custom JavaScript code to do that.
So basically, you can use the same StyleX code in both React and also in React Native. And another thing that was talked about is this idea of being able to use elements within React Native that traditionally you'd only be able to use on the web. So if you're familiar with React Native, you can't use a div or an H1 or any of these HTML elements that you're used to because it needs to be rendered on native devices, and those elements don't exist there. But with the introduction of React Strict DOM, they basically provide those elements for you, so that way you could take the same code base and render it both on the web and on native.
On the other hand, we have a unified markup model. So divs, spans, image tags, they're coming to React Native. Now, they're not rendering web primitives. They're still going to render the native primitives behind the scenes, but you don't have to learn a whole new API to do the same UI development.
So with all of this, basically there were some trends over all of the things that were announced and the things that were talked about with day one and day two of React Conf. There's definitely a push towards the server with React Server components. There's a push towards more automatic optimization with the compiler, and also a push towards like universal code bases where you could have a React Native code base that runs on desktop and native and web and Vision Pro. And I think it was summed up best on day one in Evan's talk.
So that's what it looks like when we take the modern state of server rendering and AI and bring them universally to every single platform, seamlessly gliding between server and client in a fully typed file-based framework. We only have to configure APIs for a single platform, which is the server. And it works better than ever before to build things that work across different platforms. Waterfalls and parallel requests are all handled for us automatically, because this isn't just some random server rendering system I stood up for native. This is React Server components running on native. It's like the best that there is right now.
So imagine a world where everything is React. And obviously, it's not everything is React, but that is definitely a theme over the 2 days all the stuff that was talked about. Basically, we're reaching a point where React's running on the server, it's running on the client, it's running everywhere. And so we're potentially getting closer to this dream of write once, run anywhere, which has been around for a very long time. Almost 30 years ago, that slogan was coined by Sun Microsystems for Java. And it is an interesting thing to see. I mean, now these days, there are so many legacy and legacy Java code bases that were written a long time ago because of this promise, but now they need to be maintained. And is that where we're headed? Are we? I mean, these days, there are even some Next.js applications that are technically legacy software that needs to be maintained. But yeah, it's just an interesting historical perspective to think about. Like, there's always been this want to go towards write once, run everywhere. That's kind of where React is headed. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. We'll see. But one thing I know is if you're writing React code, you're probably running into bugs. And for that, we have Sentry. So if you haven't heard of Sentry, it is error monitoring software and a whole lot more. Basically, you can add it into your code base, and then anytime an error happens in production, you can get alerted of that error. It groups those errors together so you can see how often they're happening, when and where they're happening, and there's a whole lot more that it can do as well, including performance monitoring and profiling, session replay. You can see exactly what a user was doing whenever they came across a specific error. They also have custom alerting. There's just a ton you can do. And no matter where your crappy React code is running, Sentry supports it. So if you're just running like React with Create React App or Vite, they have a plugin. You simply just call sentry.init. It instruments your whole code base, and now you have error monitoring. They also have a plugin for Next.js. You can run this command from the command line. You'll answer a few questions. Boom, your Next.js app is instrumented as well. They also support Remix. They also support React Native. There are some docs in the Expo docs that talk about how to integrate Sentry as well. So yeah, wherever your React code is running, you can use Sentry. And I won't just dog on React. You can write crappy code in any language, and Sentry supports it. So no matter where your code is running, Sentry has an SDK that you can use to report errors. So definitely check it out. If you visit sentry.io/syntax, you can get your first 2 months free if you use code TastyTreat. So definitely check it out. All right, that's all I have for you in this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this recap. I'd love to know, is there anything that I didn't talk about that was announced at React Conf, either day 1 or 2? Let me know down in the comments. And also, if there's anything you're excited about for React, if there's anything you're excited about that I mentioned, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll see you in the next one.